Olá, muito bom dia a todos os que nos assistem pelo canal do YouTube da Universidade de São Paulo, da Faculdade de Direito. Bom dia aos meus colegas de seminário. Esse é um evento organizado pela Faculdade de Direito da USP, em parceria com a Faculdade de Direito de Manchester, no Reino Unido. É um evento sobre populismo e crise democrática na contemporaneidade, e nós temos aqui a organização desse evento pelo Grupo de Estudos e Pesquisas chamado DGP, Diálogos na Governança Pública, né? Meu nome é Rodrigo Pagani de Souza. Eu sou professor de Direito Administrativo aqui na Universidade de São Paulo e fui convidado, tive a honra de receber o convite para abrir este evento, né? O Grupo de Estudos da Governança Pública, seu organizador, é coordenado pelo professor Marcos Augusto Perez, meu colega de Departamento de Direito do Estado, aqui na USP, no Largo de São Francisco. E este grupo tem se dedicado a pesquisar várias formas institucionais de organização do Estado e das atividades do Estado com vistas à sua modernização. Hoje nós temos o prazer de receber aqui o professor, né, o nosso convidado de honra, Chris Thornhill, da Universidade de Manchester, e eu também estou ladeado aqui pelos nossos colegas pesquisadores de graduação e pós-graduação, com destaque, porque se empenharam muito na organização deste evento, para o Luca Lopes e para a Fernanda Rosa, e Luca Lopes da graduação, a Fernanda da pós-graduação aqui na USP. E o propósito da discussão sobre crise democrática e direito, né, e populismo na contemporaneidade é a publicação de um novo livro do nosso convidado de honra. E ele vai falar sobre esse livro hoje conosco. O evento será conduzido em inglês, por conta do nosso convidado e também no interesse de atendermos a uma audiência aí mais ampliada que fale inglês e possa dialogar com ele também. Então, nesse sentido, feitas essas observações iniciais, me permitam agora fazer a rápida abertura aqui em inglês e vamos seguir nesta atuada ao longo de todo o evento. So, today we have an event on populism and democracy in democratic crisis in contemporaneity. It's an event sponsored by the Faculty of Law of the University of São Paulo in partnership with the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. And here at São Paulo, this was all organized by the group of studies and research called Diálogos in Public Governance. This group of research is coordinated by my colleague, Marcos Perez, who is going to join us in a few minutes. And he's my colleague here at the Department of Public Law at the University of São Paulo. We are both professors of administrative law. And by the way, my name is Rodrigo Pagani de Souza. This event is due to a new book that has been written by our guest of honor. Our guest of honor is Professor Chris Thornhill from the University of Manchester. He has been researching on the social foundations of constitutionalism for over the last decade, at least. He has been a visiting professor in many universities here in Brazil, like the University of Recife, the University of São Paulo, Unicinos, and in many universities in Europe as well, especially the University of Bielefeld in Germany. We are very delighted to have him here today to discuss with us about his new book. His new book is called Democratic Crisis in the Global Constitutional Law. It has been recently launched in Portuguese with the title Crise Democrática e o Direito Constitucional Global e o Constitucionalismo Global, pela editora Contracorrente. And it has been launched by Editora Contracorrente, and the editor-in-chief of Editora Contracorrente will also be joining us in a few minutes, Professor Rafael Valim, who has been in touch with Professor Chris Thornhill for longer than I. And well, what shall I say next? Well, the book that we are going to talk about is an attempt to understand the design of democracy throughout the world, especially the erosion of democracy throughout the world, in particular within societies that have experienced the ascension of power of populist parties and movements. And for instance, like Brazil, I could add. The book proposes a theoretical model for the understanding of this process of destabilization of democracy, of erosion of democracy. It talks about different hybrid democracies around the world that is democracies that might be formally called democratic systems, but in their essence, in their core, they actually do not have within themselves the institutions, the real accountability institutions to the people. So this is a problem that we are facing nowadays for some time. We've been facing it in many countries, not only Brazil. And Professor Chris Thornhill has made a very thoughtful book around these subjects. And we are really, really delighted to have him here again. It's not the first time he's joining us at the University of São Paulo. It's the second time. And Professor Chris, please be always welcome here. We think we can learn a lot with your thoughts, and we'd like to have a very informal conversation, even if it's transmitted through YouTube. We'd like to have a very informal conversation on your book with our group of studies, and in a short moment, our colleagues Marcos Perez and Rafael Valim will be joining us. Thanks again for your time, for being so kind to be here with us again. And I'm looking forward to hearing you and to learn with you a lot. Please.
Rodrigo, I'm here.
Well, hi,
so
Professor
much.
Marcos. Thanks for being here. Professor Chris.
Thank you so much for such kind words. And let me say that really the gratitude is all mine. I'm so delighted to be in conversation and dialogue with colleagues in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, different parts of Brazil. And my only regret is that I'm not actually physically in Sao Paulo. I'm very happy in Manchester, but I am physically happy. I am physically in Manchester at the moment and not in Sao Paulo, which is a cause for some regret, of course. But thank you very much indeed for asking me to take part in these discussions today. And of course, my extraordinary gratitude is due to Rafael Valim, who was responsible for organizing the translation of the book into Portuguese, and the magnificent translators who rendered the book so quickly. Thank you, everybody, for your interest in this text. And my plan was simply to just talk about some of the main ideas in the book for half an hour, and then speak very informally. I hadn't realized I was going to be on YouTube. I would have worn a tie, and I would have prepared something slightly more formal. I was told just a few minutes ago that I was about to be broadcast. Anyway, so I hope it's acceptable to everybody that we conduct the discussions in an informal way. And I present the main ideas in the book, and please then, I look forward to receiving commentary or criticism in whatever form. I just made some notes about the book that I'm going to read from. The book is based in a critical engagement with the basic normative structures, basic normative principles that underpin theories of democracy and theories of constitutional democracy. And I start with the very broad observation that we can identify currently, and this varies very rapidly over time and changes almost week by week, but we can identify currently a particular phenomenon in global society in which, at a point in which the global diffusion of democracy became high, democracy was established perhaps not as a global form, but at least as a global normative expectation in the decades after the 1980s. You can now see a situation in which many polities in different ways move away from democracy as it is conventionally defined. And to some degree, this affects disproportionately democracies that were created in the 1980s and afterwards. But it clearly affects other democracies as well, in that I live in a society which likes to see itself, I think very erroneously, as an old democracy. I don't think that the UK is an old democracy. It embarked on a process of democratization very early, but it didn't reach the end of this process until relatively late. But I live in a society which I would see quite clearly as a democracy that is in crisis. So the manifestation of crisis potentials in democracy is not exclusive to democracies in Latin America or democracies in Eastern Europe that were created in the 1980s and afterwards. It's a general phenomenon. So this raises a question to me, which is maybe our understanding of democracy generates problems for the actual institutionalization of democratic political systems. If we reached a point where democracy approaches a high level of global diffusion, and exactly at this point, democracies begin to become weaker, begin to unravel, maybe there is something problematic in the basic vocabulary in which we think about democracy. Maybe the problem is the theoretical conceptual architecture in which we address democracy. So this was my question, and I began to address this question by thinking about the concept of popular sovereignty, which is essentially the irreducible unit in analysis of democracy. It's very difficult to think about democracy without proceeding from the concept of popular sovereignty as the essential foundation of democracy. And of course, this is enshrined in different constitutional texts. So it's not just democracy per se, it's constitutional democracy, more specifically, in which the theory of popular sovereignty forms, as it were, the organizing norm, the steering norm. And I wanted to I'd like to say, and I realise that some of this may be provocative. I'd like to say that to some degree we can identify crisis potentials or endemic weaknesses in democracy because the concept of popular sovereignty doesn't really provide a basis for the organisation of democracy. And in some ways, this concept actually it generates tendencies or propensities within democratic systems that undermine democracy. And to address this, in the book, I tried to go back to the beginnings of modern democracy, which we can identify diversely in different contexts, of course, but I would say the earliest organizational structures in modern societies which began to approach democracy, or began to at least establish a norm of democratic self-legislation as a basis for government, we would find in the constitutional revolutions in the USA and in France in the late 18th century. And it's at this point, of course, that the concept of popular sovereignty really becomes widespread. Now, I tried to say that in the book that at this point in the 18th century, the concept of popular sovereignty develops for reasons that are very historically contingent. And we need to begin to articulate and dissect the historical reasons, the structural motivations that gave rise to the concept of popular sovereignty in order, A, to understand it, and B, to understand its implications, its consequences for modern society. That at one level, and this is very closely connected with the original history of modern democracy. At one level, we could say that, so I'm just having a bit of trouble with the screen here now. So just bear with me. Oh yeah, I've got you all back. At one level, when we look at the rise of the initial rise of modern democracy, it was a process that didn't really have very much to do with popular sovereignty. That we can trace the earliest rise of modern democracy to processes, at least in the European context, in which the concept of popular sovereignty was relatively irrelevant. And particularly, we can trace the rise of democratic systems, or the emergence of systems with a set of legal processes. We can link the early rise of democratic institutions to processes of centralization, in which national institutions of a legal and political nature became more inclusive in the societies in which they operated, in which legal orders were imposed across the wide geographical spaces that national societies include. And we can also identify the rise of early democracy with processes of individualization, which individual people, individual subjects in society are connected more directly to the centralized institutions in the societies in which they live. So ideas of citizenship and integration and inclusion develop around these processes. These are not quite the same. These processes are not quite the same as processes connected to concepts of popular sovereignty. Most particularly, we can identify the early rise of democratic institutions with processes in which human labor was increasingly liberated, and national institutions or central institutions penetrated more deeply into national societies and established connections with individual subjects, individual members of society who'd previously been subject to the administrative regimes agreed and enforced by the local aristocracy. So the freedom of labor, the increasing freedom of labor that we identify as a source of democratization, in the 18th century was a crucial driving process at this time. And the liberation of labor in Europe, which we would identify in the 18th century, is also very strongly bound up with a process of individualization and a process of centralization, which individual people were connected directly with state institutions. At the same time, however, if we identify, let's say, individualization and the liberation of labor, centralization of political institutions as drivers behind the early rise of democracy, we can also say that the early rise of democracy was driven by a second set of processes. And these processes acquired vital importance in the subsequent development of democratic societies, in that the rise of democracy, and above all, the concept of popular sovereignty, which came to support democratic systems, were connected with the development of new forms of military recruitment. So that the actual breakthroughs, the actual revolutionary moments in the development of early democratic systems were very strongly connected with the formation of new military recruitment systems, most particularly in which national institutions imposed military conscription on their populations. Now, this is less strongly articulated in the USA, although the American Revolution undoubtedly took place in an environment that was shaped by new military recruitment processes, in that the revolution, the construction of citizenship during the revolution was very clearly linked to the need to create new armies, and the eventual establishment of the drafting of the federal constitution and its entry into force in 1789 were followed by the imposition of conscription laws, which were never fully implemented. But in Europe, the connection between early democratic revolution, early constitution making, and military conscription is absolutely clear. These are totally inseparable processes. And indeed, we could say that the first constitutions created in Europe, I think we can say this without any risk of exaggeration. The first constitutions created in Europe, the Polish constitution and the French constitutions in the 1790s, were to a large degree written as what we might call political military contracts, in which people were given constitutional rights and they acquired the status of citizenship under constitutional regimes. But to obtain these rights, people were expected to provide a particular service, that is military service. So the constitutions really developed as kind of as contracts in which governments quite literally gave rights to citizens, and in giving these rights they purchased a particular supply of violence, a particular supply of military violence from the citizens in question. Now, there's not very much research on this question. Recently, a book has been published, which slightly after my book, actually, slightly later, but which looks at very similar questions in a very different perspective. It's a book by the historian Linda Colley, about the relationship between the army and early constitutionalism. It's an important, very interesting book. But the point that I'd like to make is a kind of distilled constitutional argument rather than a historical argument. And this is that if we see constitutions in their origins as military contracts, this implies that the powers and the entitlements conferred upon citizens through early constitutions had a military focus. And the basic status of the citizen as a constitutional subject is constructed through military pressures. In other words, the point that I'm making is that the basic idea that underlies modern democratic systems or modern constitutional systems is that the citizen is a sovereign subject, but a citizen acquires sovereignty, or a group of citizens acquire sovereignty at one given moment as part of a military contract. Now, so I'm just returning to my script for a second. The implication of this is that the different political rights exercised by citizens at the origins of modern democratic formation, the right to stand for public office, the right to take part one way or another in political decision-making processes, the right to participate in elections, basic political rights granted to citizens as parts of a sovereign body, are always articulated with consonant military obligations. Now, this is very clear in the first constitutions in revolutionary France. The revolution essentially in France was caused by the fact that the pre-existing military system was too expensive. The government collapsed because it couldn't raise enough taxation to support a standing army. And it replaced the standing army with an army of conscripts. And by the early Napoleonic period, involuntary military conscription was uniform in France. In Poland at the same time, I mean, Poland is a very important example in this case, which also had a constitution in 1791. It didn't really take effect. But the Polish constitution also was tied to experiences of military crisis. The Polish government had struggled to maintain an army, particularly in face of the aggressive interventions of other states surrounding Poland. And one of the purposes of the new constitution was to create a new basis for a national army. It didn't work. Now, these processes were copied throughout revolutionary Europe. Where essentially, I mean, I'm simplifying slightly, but wherever we look across revolutionary Europe, we can see that the rise of the concept of the sovereign citizen with certain constitutionally defined rights is linked to military service. Now, after the revolutionary period, this stopped for a little while in most societies, not in all of them. But in most societies, this stopped for a little while. But by the decades after 1848, and it's really, constitutionalism really began to develop. It really began to take shape as a structure for the organization of government in the decades after 1848. Not many constitutions remained in place after the revolutionary period. But after 1848, and then most particularly with the unification of Germany, with the unification of Italy, and with the foundation of the Third Republic in France, so really between 1860 and the early 1870s, constitutionalism became very widespread. And at this time, the linkage between the sovereign citizen and the soldier that had been articulated in the revolutionary period was greatly reinforced. And I think this is extremely important in that wherever we look, we can describe this as the second wave of constitution making, the period between 1848 and the early 1870s. And almost wherever we look at this point, we see the creation of constitutions which are tied to intensified processes of military conscription. That is, constitutions either prescribe military conscription or they're accompanied by laws, subsidiary laws, that impose military conscription. So if we just run through a few of these, let's just hope that I get the dates right. In Germany, the North German Federation, a constitution was introduced in 1867 and conscription was introduced in 1867. In Austria, a constitution was introduced in 1867 and conscription was introduced in 1868. In France, conscription was introduced in 1873. A new constitution was introduced in 1875. In Italy, a constitution was introduced incrementally, but particularly through the unification process. And the unification process brought with it conscription. So becoming a citizen of Italy essentially meant also becoming a soldier at the same time. And this was reflected in smaller societies as well, like Serbia and Denmark and a number of other cases. But even in Britain, which didn't have full conscription, the intensification of imperial expansion in the 1870s brought with it increased recruitment for the army and constitutional reforms, which gave electoral rights to a larger number of citizens. So war, constitution making, and the construction of the sovereign citizen are inseparable processes. Now, this has implications for how we think about democracy. We can say at one level, the connection between war and democracy, or the connection between war and constitution making, was beneficial, at least for the penetration of political rights into society, in that these processes created, obviously, to some degree, forms of attachment within society that extended across different regional groups and different social groups. This may be the case. Some people would certainly argue this. But we can also say that these connections had less beneficial outcomes, which in some ways have proved fateful for the development of modern democracy. And I would like to say, somewhat provocatively, and at the risk of exaggeration, that the connection between democratic constitutionalism and the army never goes away. To some degree, it's always there. It can always come back. I mean, this is a connection that can disappear beneath the surface of society. But the management of this connection between constitutional law and military processes is always a very delicate balance. But broadly, I would say that the connection between the military and democratic constitution making has a series of consequences. One is that this connection tended to militarize societies, in that armies became organizations that admitted people to rights of citizenship, but armies then also became the guardians of democracy, in that they had to manage the incorporation of citizens in democratic frameworks. And of course, armies generally are quite a double function, in that they integrated people in democratic systems, but they also had to ensure that people behaved in a particular way, that they adhered to political ideals or social objectives that didn't destabilize emerging national democracies. So armies acquired a simultaneously integrational and controlling role. And in some ways, it's in this point that we can identify the origins of modern nationalism. The armies became institutions that inculcated nationalist beliefs in different populations, particularly in Europe, but also in Latin America. And very importantly in this respect, the linkage between the army, so military recruitment, constitution making, was also connected with the rise of national education systems. So almost invariably, when you see the creation of national constitutions, you see the creation of national conscription laws, and you also see national education reforms, in which the number of people integrated into educational institutions increases. And typically, originally, educational institutions obviously had educational functions, but they also had ideological functions, in that national education was strongly connected to the army. It's very the convergence between these two processes is very close. In fact, one phenomenon we can find repeatedly in European history is that when in the 19th century, when states lost wars, the governments went home, introduced conscription, but they also introduced educational reforms as well, because they thought one reason why they lost the war was because their soldiers were not very well educated. So this connection, the militarization of society, but also the establishment of military units as parts of a system of what we might call national indoctrination or national education. We can also see that the connection between conscription and constitution making typically meant that constitutions were created in which the army was a privileged path to citizenship. The military service provided a basis for citizenship, but also that constitutions tended to include exclusionary elements, or they were at least flanked by exclusionary concepts of citizenship. We can also see through this period that many democracies developed on a pattern in which democracy itself was quite close to warfare, that is, or quite close to imperialism, in that states took control of their own societies through means which often had an exceptionalist character. And indeed, in many states, whether we look at Germany and Italy in the 1860s, whether we look at the USA in the 1860s, we could also look at Poland in the 1920s. These are important examples of states that were in which nations were formed as constitutional units through a process that was not very different from military colonization. So armies actually did, in a very structural, material way, become nation-building units. I'm not going to go into Brazilian history at this point, but I think one could say something very similar about the role of the military in Brazil, and particularly the linkage between military recruitment and nation building at the end of the empire, connected with the Paraguayan War, which obviously was a war which paralleled for at least for a short period of time, and certainly in Paraguay, which paralleled military occurrences in Europe at the same time. But perhaps most importantly, I would wish to say that, in a way, this is what I mean when I say that the military dimension of constitutionalism never disappeared. But to some degree, democracies developed on a pattern in which democracy always had some similarities with civil war. In that democracies developed through a contract in which the national governments purchased violence from citizens. There are very few exceptions to this. It's only when you get to the 1980s that you begin to see a wave of constitution making in which the army was not a primary actor. I mean, there are some exceptions prior to this, but this is the first process of large-scale democratic constitution making in which military organizations were not dominant, and they were still prominent in some cases. But because of this, democracy necessarily developed on a pattern which was close to civil war, in that states, through constitutions, purchased violence from their citizens. And this meant that citizens who didn't want to provide violence were targeted, so that most constitutions generated civil war or something close to civil war along these lines. But it also meant that relations between different social groups became extremely incendiary, so that as citizenship was constructed on a military basis, the relationship between different groups of citizens also acquired a military character. I mean, if you go back and read the classics of sociology, read Marx and somewhat later Max Weber, it's striking today how the description of intergroup interaction at this point is saturated with military terms. Engels, of course, was a very keen student of Clausewitz and understood interaction and articulation between different groups as an essentially military process. But I would say this is not a coincidence, because citizens were integrated into the political system through the army, and it could not be the case that this would then have, that this would determine the nature of interaction between different social groups. And the military or character of democracy, or the character of democracy that moved it close to civil war, became more and more manifest as more and more citizens were integrated in the political system. So as constitutions penetrated more and more deeply into society, identifying ever increasing numbers of citizens as sovereign agents, the likelihood that democracy would degenerate into civil war became greater. And I think that we see this particularly in the period after 1918. After 1918, in most societies, for a short period of time, in most societies with some kind of democratic character, the period just around 1918, either immediately before or in the years after, saw an attempt to consolidate the notion of popular sovereignty as a political reality. That is, to incorporate an increasingly large number of citizens, at least male citizens, in the political system. But in virtually every case, this ended in a political reality of, or at least close to, civil war, typically in which the military played a role in the organization and the administration of government. So that in Europe, the number of political systems that were not dominated by the military by the mid to late 1930s, by the military or by political parties assuming some kind of military functions. I mean, fascist parties are not strictly military dictatorships, but they are parties that have assimilated some military functions. So it's not very easy to separate a fascist party from a military unit. But in Europe, the number of polities in which the military was not a dominant agent by the mid to late 1930s is small. And obviously, we can identify similar processes in Latin America at the same time. The wave of democratization in Latin America didn't go as far as in Europe, but in most cases, the outcome was quite similar. Even in Europe, even in societies in which the military wasn't dominant, it didn't play a dominant role, say, for example, France and Belgium. I mean, France and Belgium weren't really democracies because women couldn't vote at this time, but they were advanced male democracies. But even in these polities, government as a whole began to acquire certain military dimensions, in that by the mid to late 1930s, government was very, very strongly reliant upon executive legislation in which governmental figures simply utilized exceptional provisions to introduce legislation. Most of these exceptional provisions, or at least the formal structure for the use of exceptional provisions, had its origin in the First World War. Now, the essential point that I'm making in very broad strokes is that when we think our way back to the origins of modern democracy, we come to this concept of popular sovereignty, of the sovereign citizen. But the concept of the sovereign citizen is of military origin. It was a way in which governments identified citizens and persuaded them to enter into a particular contract, a contract of a military nature relating to the collective provision of violence. And citizens were given political rights under constitutions in order to persuade them to provide violence. And I would say you can say the same thing about welfare states just a little bit later. The modern welfare state institutions were created for similar reasons. That they were first created in order to persuade people to offer certain forms of security, so that citizens, typically male citizens, would engage in the provision of violence. Anyway, the problem, the consequence of this, if we think through the outcomes of this original semantic conceptual construction, is that this basic concept of modern democracy linked democratic process to violence. And it actually configured democratic process on a pattern that was irreducibly connected to military conflict. And we can also see in many ways that it meant that national societies became extremely sensitive to external configurations. As subjects were always liable to be recruited for warfare, their sensibility to international configurations or international constellations was intensified. The somewhat controversial conclusion that I draw from this, I'm coming towards the end, but the somewhat controversial conclusion that I draw from this is that democracy eventually became stabilized, as far as it did become stabilized, through a process in which the basis of legitimacy from which democracies draw substance was moved away from the sovereign citizen. So popular sovereignty actually lost its importance as the legitimational foundation for democracy. And states began to integrate their citizens and began to respond to their citizens in accordance with principles that are not derived from popular sovereignty. And I identify this particularly with the emergence of democracies after 1945. Again, democracy didn't suddenly come into being after 1945. A number of new democracies were created or old democracies reinstated after 1945, but it took a long time until they were really solidified. I would say it's only in the 1960s that democracy began to take shape as a general norm, or as a really embedded reality. It's only in the 1980s that it became a universal expectation, but it began to take shape as quite a broad reality between 1945 and the late 1960s. And this was really based upon two processes that don't have anything to do with popular sovereignty. It's based on one process, which is the increasing consolidation of international human rights regimes. And it's based on a second process, which is the consolidation of welfare states. In the rise of democracy at this time is really structurally based in these two processes, and these two processes frame the interactions between governments and citizens. But neither of these processes really has an origin in popular sovereignty. Both of them really have an international origin in that international human rights law obviously comes from the international domain. We tend to think of welfare states as national creations, but welfare states also have a transnational origin in that most welfare states were based upon transnational models that were created during the Second World War and implemented in very different ways in different societies. The classic social democratic argument, or Marxist oblique stroke social democratic argument, is that welfare states are created through as class compromises, and that they tend to be more consolidated in societies with strong labour movements. Well, I mean, there's obviously some foundation to this, but we can identify if we look at the origins of most welfare systems today, we find that they were created in circumstances which were not obviously dictated by intergroup struggle or by struggle between different social groups. The British welfare state, which was originally a strong welfare state, it's not now, was based on a report which was commissioned by a Conservative government. And whatever one says, whatever myths there are about Britain in South America, Britain did not have a strong tradition of labour integration before 1945. The Labour Party had been a participant in government on a couple of occasions, but within an institutional framework which minimised its impact, i.e. either as a minority government or in coalition with more powerful conservative parties. And the French welfare state was drafted by the exile government in London during the Second World War by Gaullists, essentially, who can be are not necessarily leaders of the international proletariat. So these are issues that we need to think about here. But the problem that I touch on then right at the end is the problem about the crisis of democracy today. And I draw a conclusion which has made me very unpopular with many people, but I'll articulate it anyway, which is that essentially democracy, there are exceptions to this, and there are variations in this process, of course. I'm not saying it's a absolutely universal template, but usually we see crises in democracy where the two integrational structures on which democracy reposes, that is the consolidation of international human rights law and the consolidation at the inner societal level of welfare states, become weak. In these circumstances, citizens are released from integrational processes that connect them with their governments and which contribute to social pacification. And under these circumstances, particularly where investment in welfare states is reduced, there is always a possibility that the military dimension of citizenship will be rearticulated. There is always a possibility that individuals will attach themselves to military collectivities rather than other social groups. I suppose what I'm saying is that there's always a possibility of radical de-individualization when welfare states are weakened. And it's the process of individualization linked to human rights law and linked to welfare states, which is really fundamental for the stability of democracies. It's not forms of collective mobilization. So under certain conditions, there is always a possibility that people will fall back into the military roles which originally defined democracy. And I would say we can see this in some democracies today, the possibility that democracy will move back towards military patterns of integration becomes tangible, becomes palpable to varying degrees in different democracies. Now, Brazil may be a rather extreme case of this at the moment. Indeed, I think it is. I don't think it's the only case. But the very unpopular conclusion that I would wish to draw from this is that, to some degree, the classical vocabulary of democracy makes this problem worse, because it creates an understanding that really democracy is about the exercise of sovereignty by groups of people rather than about patterns of individual integration. And under conditions in which the integrational structure of democracy is weakened either by the reduction in the force of human rights law or by the reduction of investment in welfare systems, people can be persuaded to take up, be persuaded to imagine themselves as sovereign agents. And political parties particularly can disconnect themselves, or individual politicians can disconnect themselves from the constitutional order of government and encourage people to identify with new collectives, usually tend to have a nationalist nature. So the original military form of democracy never disappears entirely from the structure of society. It can always become visible again. And I mean, I wrote this book before the events in the USA, obviously after Trump was elected out of office, but a degree of political militarization became manifest at this time, which would not perhaps have been expected. This is just one exemplification of this. But one key reason for this is because of the vocabulary in which we actually describe democracy, in that we need to configure our description of democracy to that institutional reality which democracy actually is, which is essentially a system of integration whose origins are in the late 18th century, connected to processes of individualization, the liberation of labor, and so on, but which in some way was deviated onto a fateful pathway by the fact that the liberation of labor, the centralization of government, was connected with processes of militarization. So if we're to defend democracy, we need to do so within the framework, within a new terminological framework. And the standard definitions of democracy, the standard understandings of democratic subjects, will not really provide an apparatus for the effective defense and organization of democracy. It's actually more likely to be the other way around, that these are terms which can be hijacked and sabotaged by groups that have very limited investment in democracy. It's very difficult to find a populist government today that doesn't legitimize itself through popular sovereignty, and which appeals to popular sovereignty outside the complex structural systems, complex structural frameworks in which sovereignty can actually be exercised. So none of this implies that democracy is a reality in which citizens do not exercise autonomy, but autonomy needs to be framed within a deeper integrational constitution, which is likely to involve strong protection for individual rights and strong protection for welfare, very closely connected to each other. I'm sorry, I've gone on a bit longer than I expected. I just wanted to present the thesis in a kind of nutshell. I hope this is okay. And thanks very much for listening. I greatly appreciate it.
We are the ones who are thankful. Well, a brilliant presentation we had here today. And now the floor is open for discussion. Anyone who wants to raise a question, please do that. We have here with us some colleagues from the group of study, some undergraduate and graduate students, and also Professor Marcos Perez. So please feel free to ask questions.
Rodrigo and Chris and Valim and our students. First, good afternoon, Chris. Good afternoon. Hi. In England, good morning, Brazil. I have to congratulate you, Chris, on this amazing academic work that you gave us. It's really fantastic. Fantastic.
Oh, Marcus, thank you so much.
Yeah, the research that you conducted, Chris, and the original conclusion you bring us are fantastic. It's an honor to be by your side today and to be able to start, perhaps, a joint journey at this event, joining the study force of the two universities, Manchester and São Paulo. I think we, England and Brazil, Manchester and São Paulo, can share more than good soccer players. We can share ideas, we can share knowledge.
The capital of the Northern Hemisphere and the capital of the Southern Hemisphere, what really?
Yeah, I also want to thank and congratulate Rafael Valim for introducing me to Chris. This you saw this giant of constitutional law, but also for accepting my invitation to participate in this round table, and especially for the excellent translation to Portuguese of this book that I now consider essential in the contemporary bibliography of legal sociology and constitutional law. Finally, I want to thank Professor Rodrigo Pagani too for helping us with this webinar, and for everything we have been doing together since 2013, the year we officially became professors at the University of São Paulo. Rodrigo is leaving us for a time, for a season in the United States, and we will be sorely missed, my friend. And also, I have to thank all the students who are part in the group Dialogues in Public Governance, without the efforts of which I can say that we would simply not have this roundtable. Chris, as we say here in Brazil, let me use my spoon in your pot. Your ideas are original and provocative and make us think and reflect on global history and in particular on Brazilian history and contemporaneity. Many of the classical principles that underlie democratic politics. I need to share my earplugs. 1 minute.
Listen me? Yeah?
Yeah, we're listening.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Some words, just some words, Rodrigo and Chris. Many of the classical principles that underlie democratic politics and its theoretical constructions now appear for you, Chris, invalid. In particular, the essential focus on legislative branch, which supports in thesis the legitimacy of laws. Nowadays, legitimacy or democracy indeed are extracted not from the concrete acts of citizens or from process of popular will formation, but to a large degree from human rights norms, which are preserved and enacted within an existing transitional legal order. Basic human rights are usually declared at an international level and then internalized with domestic legal system. Your work, Chris, leads us to believe that a new model of democracy has begun to emerge after 1945, in which legal procedures have moved from legislative and political arena to global space. That was I understood. We can say that there is a broad interpenetration between the national legal system and global legal system. So the essential concepts of democracy, such as people, nation, popular sovereignty, citizenship, self-legislation, cannot now be used to capture the essential feature of a democracy. Regular elections and democratically elected legislative branch are not enough for a country to be considered a democracy. This is what I understood from your test, especially when you focus on the transition from what you call a citizen soldier to a citizen identified with welfare rights. Moreover, the prominence of human rights after 1945 means that diverse societal claims can be transmitted directly into the legal system, and the legal system is centered on norms that permit the effective translation of diffuse claims for rights into the formal law. But you told us, Chris, that this system does not always work well, and that this malfunction generates reactions within the democratic system that make populism possible. I don't know if we can say about fascism in place of populism in some countries, even in Brazil. In a way, pardon, it seems that some social groups start to miss the figure of the citizen soldier, which you so well described in your book. They react against global human rights. In Brazil, for example, some social groups usually identify human rights with criminal rights. They react against judicial control, identified as judicial activism, a kind of judicial disease for some social groups.
Very interesting.
They react against environment protection, against equal rights of race, gender, etc. In Brazil, particularly, this movement is accompanied by the return to the government of the military forces and other security agents. They have executive and governmental functions, and some of them are doing politics openly. We don't have easy lives or easy questions to answer, my dear Chris.
Well, thank you so much.
How do you see how to speak to Chris? How do you see how to speak?
Let me just, first of all, it feels being back in conversation with colleagues in Brazil is like an experience in which somebody has put the oxygen back in the air. In that I miss so much the opportunity to talk to my colleagues in Brazil because of the pandemic. So thank you very much for these questions. I'd just like to make a couple of points in response to this. I think your question is partly an agreement and partly a disagreement. But when I'd like to make one point, which is just a historical claim, which is that if we define democracy in very basic terms, we just say this is a system of government in which all men and women can vote and a government can be elected out of office. There are competitive elections. Now, this system didn't really exist before 1945. There were some experiments, but really, it's probably only Sweden and New Zealand which were really democracies before 1945, maybe Finland and maybe Ireland. So we need to try to explain why, and this is a very important historical point, because it means that our theoretical analysis is not burdened by the assumption, the incorrect assumption, that democracy has a long tradition. It doesn't have a long tradition, it's recent. And as I said before, it's only in the 1980s that it became a kind of global expectation. But really where we look across the globe, we see that democracy really it's not framed by acts of will formation. And it's not really accurate to see it as a system of will formation or as a system of sovereignty. We should really see it as a system of integration, a system in which individual people, most particularly individual people who are relatively free in the exercise of their labor, are integrated into a system of political administration. And wherever we try to observe democracies, this is really essentially what happens. And I don't want to say that legislative functions are not relevant in democracy, but what I do want to say is that they typically do not work when they're not framed within a wider integrational constitution, which is usually based upon individual rights and welfare systems. As far as these can be separated, I don't think that individual rights and welfare systems are really different from each other, very closely connected. So I don't want to say that the legislative process is not important, but it's a secondary process. It's a mistake to see it as a primary constitutional dimension of a democracy. It's a secondary dimension of a democracy. And where the integrational dimension of society, so the welfare, human rights systems, become weak, the legislative dimension of society, it's usually under these conditions that it begins to malfunction. And what you say to me about the way in which social groups in Brazil can be mobilized against human rights and they denounce human rights as criminal rights, I mean, this is very important and greatly supports my theory. My theory being that when the integrational structures of society become weak, it's easy to persuade people to identify with collective forms of organization that are actually directly hostile to their own interests. In that, I claim no expertise in this, and I may be wrong in applying this to Brazil, although I think that this does apply to Brazil. But it's perfectly possible across the globe today to identify a number of societies with strong populist dimensions in which beneficiaries of welfare regimes, in which I include healthcare and education, can be motivated to oppose welfare regimes in the name of popular sovereignty. This is the paradox that is at the heart of populism. So essentially, I think that everything you say really connects very closely with my theory. Brazil would seem to me to be one of the cases, the more extreme cases, where this suppressed connection between democracy and militarization is becoming strongly articulated. But we can see this in other societies. It's perhaps most consistently visible in Brazil. The other point that I would like to make, and it goes back to the question about welfare, is that essentially, and this is more implicit in the last book, I've established this in my mind somewhat more robustly over the last few months. I think what happens at the heart, essentially, democracies develop out of the army. And welfare states develop from the army as well, including education systems. I include the education system as part of a welfare system. But in relatively stable democracies, welfare systems that were created by the army become separate from the army. So that, and this usually takes place as welfare states are created on increasingly universal designs, as they also take shape in societies without recent experiences of warfare. But there's always a possibility that controversies over welfare can be remilitarized. And I would say this is something that we need to think about in Brazil. Not only in Brazil, but this is something that we need to think about, that although there was a strong push for a welfare consensus under Lula, this welfare consensus did not take very deep root in society, and it remains highly contested.
Thank you, Chris. Well, if you let me, I would suggest to have a word from Valim. And I'm sorry, Perez, that I didn't call you before. Thank you for your kind words towards me as well. let us hear Valim, right? Is he here with us?
I don't think so, Rodrigo. I think Valim went out.
I think he lost the connection, maybe.
Lost the connection. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But our students have questions as well. If you
Good.
don't have any more questions yourselves, we can pass to the student questions.
Okay,
Yes.
Fernanda. Yes.
Please, Fernanda, let us do that. Yeah.
Okay. So who wants to make the first question?
I can start. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, first of all, I'm Vinicius, a third-year student at the University of São Paulo, and a member of the study group Diálogos on Public Governance. First of all, thanks, Professor Thornhill, for the enlightening presentation. And now I'm starting with the questions sent by all members of our study group. Our first question was sent by Enzo, and I'll read it. In your book, you propose that a new perspective and structure of democracy would need to recognize the legitimacy of other acts and processes that not those of the constituent subjectivity. That said, could you explain what would be those other sources of legitimacy, and moreover, what other measures could be done to increase the known character of our constitutional democracies?
I'm so sorry, an aeroplane just went across my house.
Okay, no, I can repeat, no problem.
Could you just ask the question again?
Yes, sure. In your book, you propose that a new perspective and structure of democracy would need to recognize the legitimacy of other acts and processes that not those of the constituent subjectivity. That said, could you explain what would be those other sources of legitimacy, and moreover, what other measures could be done to increase the known character of our constitutional democracies?
To increase the what character?
Yes, no, the known character.
I think he means the subjective character. Because like in Portuguese, those are synonyms. So sometimes
it makes sense.
The translation gets a little.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Listen, I hope I've got the question right in my mind. If not, it's just a mixture of sort of alienation through the screen and a slight background noise of air traffic. So I hope I've got the question. I mean, it's very interesting. It's a very interesting point. It goes back to the point I'm making about democracy as a form of individual integration rather than a system of sovereignty. I would say that the legitimacy of democracy can be measured to a large degree by the number of subjects that are different subjectivities within society that it can actually assimilate, can actually integrate. So that we find in many societies that democracies will integrate multiple subjects, different pluralistic groups within society, without an obvious democratic mandate for so doing, usually on the basis of international agreements, so that gender subjectivities, sexual subjectivities, ethnic subjectivities will be integrated into democracies, but the actual process through which this situation is arrived at is separate from any demonstrable form of sovereignty. So I think that we need to think about democratic subjectivity in much more pluralistic form. It goes back a bit to the previous question, speaks slightly to the previous question. Democratic subjectivity shouldn't be seen as sovereign subjectivity. It should be seen as aggregated forms of individual subjectivity. So in some ways, we can almost identify the legitimacy of a constitution by the extent to which it will integrate multiple forms of subjectivity. Did I get any other question?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have other questions as well, because the students said to us, who's next?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is May. First, I would like to congratulate Chris on this great presentation. My question is the following. In your book, you read about how, in the majority of cases, the populist support is sustained by the political party's capability of projecting national identities associated with anti-minority state sentiments. Therefore, since the 21st century is characterized by globalization, which fosters migratory movements and cultural exchange between countries, do you think that this characteristic can stimulate the constitution of populist governments? Thank you.
In what way would that occur? Sorry, could you just give me an example?
Well, I was thinking about how in Brazil, for example, the president is always, during the pandemic, was always making statements against China or against some Asian countries, for example. So in 21st century, when globalization is always promoting cultural exchange and migratory waves, do you think that this blend of cultures can stimulate populism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very difficult to... The rights that are exercisable in a form that reinforces democratic life are usually of a transnational nature. Of course, this varies a bit from society to society, but it's the strategy that governments have. Sorry, I've lost May now. Are you still here, May? The strategy of the government, I mean, many governments legitimize themselves specifically in opposition to the rights that make democracy possible. And they do so by, exactly as you say, by referring to notions of popular sovereignty. But the outcome of this is almost invariable, in that when governments legitimize themselves through popular sovereignty against transnationally constructed rights, the quality of the democracy legitimated in this way declines. So what you say is absolutely true, and this almost invariably provides reinforcement for the claims that I'm making. But this is a very common phenomenon, not only in Brazil, but we find examples of this in South Asia and Europe as well at the same time. But definitely.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we have reached our time of 1 hour and 30 minutes. But if the students have any more questions, we can maybe send them to you via email, Chris.
Sure.
I don't know.
Absolutely. I'm going on holiday on Friday, but before then or after holiday, it's fine.
Chris, one more question.
Sure.
What do you think about Russia and China in terms of integration with the global environment of human rights consecration?
Well, I mean, this is a big question, and I would get a Nobel Prize if I could just answer you straight away. Now, I speak more about, I mean, China, it would seem to me, okay, I have no great expertise here. I mean, I have an interest in Chinese politics, but it would seem to me that we can look at China as an example of a society where the deep connection between legislation and the military is still in place. In certain respects. Now, the situation in Russia, I would say, I mean, I have to be careful. These are very difficult issues. But in the case of in the case of China, you can also say that the globalization of the Chinese economy necessarily involves certain constitutional elements, certain processes of international integration that are not avoidable. But I would say with Russia that a system of government developed after the catastrophe of the Yeltsin years, a system of government developed in Russia in which there was an attempt to articulate aspects of the Russian polity with international frameworks. And initially, this was quite successful, and in some respects, it still is successful in that the image of Russia from outside as a completely authoritarian system, I think, is misconstructed. It's become more authoritarian in recent years, but the more democratic aspect, we need to see it as a composite polity with some very authoritarian elements and some more democratic elements. And this composite polity is placed in what I would call a composite transnational constitution, in that parts of the Russian polity are strongly connected to transnational rights frameworks. And these are the parts of the polity that are more democratic. But this is becoming weaker because of international security pressures. This is becoming weaker. The articulation between Russia and international normative systems, which originally solidified the more democratic parts of the polity, is becoming weaker. That's a different issue. I'm not going to make any comment on the security situation because I'm not an authority. I mean, I have worked on Russian constitutional law quite extensively, and I would say that we need to see it as a composite polity which contains extremely heterogeneous elements. But the articulation between Russia and the international normative systems is becoming much weaker.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Chris, thank you as well. And please, would you like to say any final word? I mean, I would suggest that you close our meeting.
Okay.
And any final word eventually regarding democracy in Latin America or something?
Well,
yeah. Well,
I mean, I think I've said enough today. You know, these are all big statements, and lots of very detailed empirical argument is required to back up these statements. But I would like to say that the importance that the global community needs to attach to Brazil as a democracy cannot be overstated. We need to see Brazil as one of the most important democracies in the world. And what happens in Brazil has implications that reach far, far beyond national boundaries. This is a democracy of transnational importance. And my thoughts are always with you. Intellectually and emotionally, and I'm very grateful to you all for resuming this discussion now in this form.
All right, we appreciate that. We appreciate a lot. We are very thankful for your thoughts and concerns and your final message. We'll carry that with us, and hopefully we'll be seeing each other soon in a new event, in a new discussion. Thank you all for joining us. Professor Perez, would you like to say something, or fine?
Just I hope we will overcome our problems here in Brazil. And
I hope we overcome ours.
We are resistant.
We are resisting, yeah.
Yeah.
And thank you for everybody who is with us in this beginning of the afternoon.